All right, so friends, in this Catechist Toolbox tutorial, we're going to do what I'm calling a Bible Basics test case, looking at a specific passage from Scripture that I'm calling Jacob the Wrestler here, taken from the book of Genesis. This tutorial follows very closely upon the Bible Basics 2 tutorial on how to read the Bible. So if you haven't checked that out yet, it's probably be a good idea to do so before watching this one. In that tutorial, one of the things that was discussed was that when we read scripture, there's three things that need to be kept in mind always. And the first is the aim of the scriptural text, right? So the Bible has the aim always in every single passage throughout the whole has an aim of communicating the truths of salvation to us. We'll see how this particular passage does this in the interplay between the literal and spiritual senses that we're going to discuss. So we talked about the literal and spiritual senses in a bit more detail in the Bible Basics tutorial on how we read the Bible. And we said that the spiritual senses always presuppose and are based on the literal sense of Scripture. And that's how we'll approach reading this passage here. We also said that there has to be a healthy interplay or tension between the two types of senses in order to gain the most insight on what a given passage is telling us. And it's when we use those various senses together that we'll see how this passage, as I say, communicates the truths of salvation to us. We also talked about how it's important to remember that the Bible is, in fact, one book. Right? It's one book that tells the story of salvation history, of how God acts on behalf of the human family for the sake of their salvation. In terms of interpreting the passage that we're working with here, the unity of Scripture is going to come out most clearly when we discuss the spiritual senses. And then finally, we said that although one, the Scriptures are in some sense many, because while it is one book, the Bible has many books, like a library. We talked about how that's important specifically for understanding or determining the genre of a given passage or a book of Scripture. And we talked about how in our How Do We Read Scripture tutorial, that genre is going to determine our approach to a given book. If we're reading the Psalms, our approach is going to be different than if we're reading a historical narrative, for instance. So genre has to be kept in mind. So when I have this passage discussed in class, I usually have students read the passage ahead of time. So one of the ways that you could approach teaching how to use the various senses of Scripture with this passage in particular would be to have students sit down as a group, pass out some Bibles, and have them read the passage together in small groups. And you could either present the larger context of the passage to them, which is important for understanding this particular passage, as is the case with any passage of Scripture. You could present that to them previous to reading it in small groups or after they read it in small groups, because I think it's a good idea to have them hear the passage a couple of different times, because when you hear it read a couple of different times, maybe it'll hit you a different way, or maybe you'll see something the second time through that you didn't see the first time. So I would recommend have them reading it in small groups initially, and then as a large group as you present the passage. So whether you decide to give them the context previous to their reading it in small groups or to the discussion in the large group, I don't think makes a whole lot of difference. Nevertheless, context is extremely important. A passage that we're dealing with here is Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. I'm calling it Jacob the Wrestler for reasons that will become obvious momentarily. The genre that we're dealing with here is historical narrative. So in order to understand what's going on in this particular passage, it's important to understand what had happened previous to this. So just some background information on the central character here. Jacob is extremely important. Jacob is the grandson of the patriarch Abraham, with whom God first establishes the covenant in Genesis 15. Abraham, of course, is known as the father of faith for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Right? So we see that referred to with respect to Christians in Paul's letter to the Romans and the book of Hebrews, for instance. With respect to the Muslims, Abraham is known as the father of faith, but then the two lines sort of diverge between the Islamic faith and the Judeo-Christian tradition, as the Muslim tradition is going to follow Abraham and then his son with Sarah's servant Hagar, Ishmael, whereas Christians are going to go ahead and follow the trajectory of Abraham's son Isaac. Isaac is the next patriarch in line in the Jewish and Christian traditions. He inherits the covenantal relationship between God and his father Abraham. Jacob is the son of Isaac and Rebekah. Jacob is also a fraternal twin. Esau is the name of his older brother. And when they're born, scripture tells us Jacob was gripping Esau's heel. It's almost as though Jacob wanted to pull Esau back into the womb because he wanted to be the firstborn. And this is very much a harbinger of what is to come in Jacob's life and Esau's life. Jacob's name literally means he supplants. So Jacob is something of a trickster. And he uses that in various times throughout his life, that sort of mentality. But he does it maybe most intentionally, or with the most severe consequences, we might say, with respect to his relationship with his brother Esau. And he does it on a couple of different occasions. As the eldest son, Esau would have been entitled to a birthright, sort of general inheritance of his father's belongings, and also to a special blessing that the firstborn son would get. And so Jacob ends up stealing both Esau's birthright and the blessing of the eldest son. One day, Esau, who is kind of like a stereotypical man, he's told, what scripture tells us that he's hairy. Esau has been out hunting, and he comes back famished. Scripture says he's on the verge of sort of starving to death. And Jacob is there. Jacob's more something of a homebody, whereas Esau's kind of like a rough and tumble like type of guy. And Jacob has some soup there. And Esau begs him for some soup because he's completely famished. And so Jacob sees himself in a very opportune position, and he says, okay, you want this soup that's going to save your life? I'll trade you. I'll give you this soup if you give me your birthright. And so Esau, faced with the prospect of death, goes ahead and trades essentially his birthright for a bowl of soup. Then, near the end of Isaac's life, Isaac has taken to bed and is ill, and his eyesight has failed him. And so Jacob and his mother, Rebekah, come up with a plan to steal the blessing of the firstborn son that would have gone to Esau. And so what they do is they put some animal skins on Jacob's hair. Esau, as I said, was a hairy guy. Jacob wasn't. And so they put animal skins so that when Jacob got close to Isaac and Isaac touched Jacob's arm, he would feel a hairy arm. And he would also smell, right, the scent of animal. And that would have been what Esau smelled like as a hunter. And so that's how they deceived, Jacob and his mother Rebekah deceived Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing that would have gone to Esau as the firstborn son. So Jacob has wronged Esau in a couple really severe ways. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, Esau plans to kill him. And so at that point, Jacob decides to get out of Dodge. And that is sort of the larger context of the passage that we're dealing with. Uh, in terms of the more immediate context, then, Jacob is coming back home. After leaving his home, he was gone for many years, and now he is returning to his native land with a growing family, and he's wondering what Esau's reaction is going to be like when he sees him again for the first time, because essentially Jacob is returning to the scene of a crime, right? And so what he does is he sends a bunch of gifts. Jacob's now at this time pretty wealthy in his own right. He sends Esau a bunch of gifts ahead of him to see what Esau's reaction will be to the reception of those gifts. Right? He's trying to make nice with his brother, but he wants to see what Esau's reaction is going to be. So that sets the context of the passage for the students. And whether or not, as I say, you set that context for them before they read it the first time, or whether you go through it before you go through it as a group, there's questions that I think are helpful for students to read in reading this passage. So check out the bottom of this page here, where you'll find a handout that includes these questions. So one of the questions I ask students is, who is Jacob wrestling with here exactly? And is it a fair fight or not? I ask also students to keep in mind and pay close attention to the names of people and places, because very often in Scripture, the names of people and places have a lot of meaning for us. And then I ask students to pay attention to what Jacob asks of his wrestling partner. Right? This is where knowing something of the context is especially helpful. And then in terms of reading the passage in the spiritual senses, I would ask students, do you see anything in this passage that would point ahead to the life of Jesus or to the life of the church, right? So they can draw in some sense from their own experience. Do they see anything in this passage that reminds them about what it means to live a Christian life? The same would go for the moral sense. Is there anything about this passage that helps us to understand how to live a life of virtue, for instance? So whereas the former question might, imply something about the church's life of worship or the sacramental life, this moral sense would get maybe more directly at how do you live the Christian life day to day. So ask students that question. And then finally, what does this passage teach us about our ultimate end, right? The anagogical sense. What does it show us about the end times, and specifically what our end as human persons is? Okay, so then I would go through the passage as a class, and hopefully, if you have time for the second time, the students having read the passage in small groups previously. Okay, so then we'll walk through an interpretation of the passage. And we said that using both literal and spiritual senses always presupposes the literal sense. So we'll start with the literal sense here. So who is Jacob wrestling with, and is it a fair fight? And we'll see that there's some ambiguity here. And the reason being that Jacob asks the name of this person that sort of confronts him out of nowhere. And it's important to know also, or to attend to the fact that it's nighttime. So he wants to know who he's wrestling with. And the name's never revealed in Scripture. The word in Hebrew that's used is ish. And that word for this figure can either refer to a human or a deity. So there's a great deal of ambiguity here, even in the literal sense. So there's other parts of this passage that suggest that Jacob is literally wrestling with God, as we'll see in a few moments. But that might mean that Jacob is wrestling with an angel. Many people interpret it this way. And why is that an acceptable response? Well, the word angel in Hebrew, malach, and angelos in Greek simply means a messenger or an envoy. And so it's quite possible that Jacob's having an encounter with God through God's messenger, right? In the same vein that Mary or Joseph will encounter angels surrounding the birth of Christ in the Gospels. Another possibility here, though, keeping in mind that it's nighttime and Jacob is sort of blindsided by this attack initially, is that Jacob perhaps is wrestling Esau. Right? He had sent gifts ahead of him to Esau, but at this point in the text, he hasn't heard back. And so, it being nighttime, it's entirely possible that Esau may have crept into Jacob's camp and attacked him in some sense. And so, how does that fit? I mean, it fits with the literal meaning of the word ish, right? It could be a human or a deity. But how would that fit or go together with this being an encounter with God? Well, right, as human persons, right, created in the image and likeness of God, we have the ability to make God present in the world. And we see this happen in all sorts of ways. So in the New Testament, this happens quite often through the prophets who come to speak on God's behalf. And they'll carry out all kinds of actions that signify God's message to the people as well. And so it's quite possible, right, that God is working directly through Esau here. So there's three possibilities, according to the literal sense, that would work, and none of which contradict one another. So then what are the names of the people and places, right? So there's two places named here, and they both have the same meaning, Peniel and Penuel. They both mean the face of God. It's important to see that both of those words end in the letters E-L, and that's sort of a shorthand for the word Elohim, which is a word for God in Hebrew. And this suggests that because the names of the place here refer to the face of God, that the author wants us to see that what's happening here is an encounter with God in some way. So whether it's through Esau or through an angel or God himself wrestling with Jacob, the names of the places suggest there's an encounter with the divine taking place, an extraordinary one. Then Jacob, after the wrestling match, gets a new name, which is going to be very significant, as we'll see in the spiritual senses. Jacob becomes Israel. Again, you see the EL suffix there. Israel means the one who wrestles with God. Again, the name change here suggesting an encounter with the divine. Then finally, what does Jacob ask of his wrestling partner? Well, he asks a blessing, right? And so remember, this is going to have bearing on our use of the spiritual senses, that Jacob had tricked Esau out of the blessing of the firstborn son. Remember also that Jacob is returning to the scene of the crime. This is where it all happened. This is where Jacob tricked his brother in really serious ways, right? That made his brother so angry that he wanted to kill him. And so now Jacob has gone through this wrestling match and he's struggled, and he asks his wrestling partner for a blessing. The idea is, within the immediate context and the place that he's at, he wants to be blessed in a way that's been arrived at without tricking anybody. And the wrestling partner goes ahead and does that. But that blessing all by itself, right, we can understand more deeply in the literal sense, but it's also going to say something to us in the spiritual senses as well. So again, just re-emphasizing that the spiritual senses are always based on and presuppose the literal sense. But the spiritual senses also help maintain the unity of Scripture as a whole. We'll start reading this passage in light of what will come later on in Scripture, and then also to understand the Christian life that we live now as well. So the first sense to take a look at is the allegorical sense, and that's reading events as signs or types of the life of Christ and the church. So most basically what we have here, and we saw in the name change of Jacob to Israel and the names of the place, Peniel and Penuel, that the passage, the language used in the passage is emphasizing and making clear to us that what's taking place here is an encounter with the divine. So the allegorical sense, using that understanding of God meeting man, we can see a figure or a type here of the incarnation, right? So it's in the incarnation of the Son of God that the human nature and the divine nature will most perfectly meet, right, in the incarnate Son of God. So we see a type or a foreshadowing there. We also see, I would suggest, a sort of type or a figure of the Eucharist. In the Eucharist and our reception thereof, we are embraced by God and we are transformed by that embrace. When you wrestle somebody, now see how this presupposes a literal sense. When you wrestle somebody, you can't help but embracing them, right? That's what wrestling is, right? It's not a comfortable embrace, of course, but it is an embrace, right? Um, and so in the Eucharist, we are embraced by God. And just as Jacob is transformed by this embrace with the divine that he experienced in his wrestling match, he has his identity transformed from Jacob to Israel, the one who struggles or wrestles with God. We are transformed each and every time that we embrace God or allow God to embrace us better in the Eucharist. So Augustine teaches us along these lines in Book 7 of his Confessions. So this is a good example, I think, of how not only sort of the principles for reading Scripture are helpful for interpreting passages, but also, being familiar with some of the great works of the Christian theological tradition are helpful. Whether it's a great father of the church like Augustine, or the doctors like Aquinas, whether it's a straightforward commentary that they've written, or a different sort of work like the Confessions. And I think a passage here from the Confessions shows us why seeing a type or a figure of our Eucharistic encounter with God is appropriate to this passage is clear in the language used by Augustine here. He says, "O eternal truth, true love, and beloved eternity, you are my God, and for you I sigh day and night. As I first began to know you, you lifted me up and showed me that while that which I might see exists indeed, I was not yet capable of seeing it. I knew myself to be far away from you in a region of unlikeness, and I seemed to hear your voice from on high. I am the food of the mature. Grow then, and you will eat me. You will not be changed into me. You will not change me, into yourself like bodily food. You will be changed into me." So we're always transformed. We become more like God when we embrace God in the Eucharist. And we'll see that something similar, or we saw that something similar happened to Jacob, quite literally in the name change, right? But it also leads to a discussion of the moral or the tropological sense in Scripture. The wrestling match suggests a struggle, right? And so what the passage, I think, is teaching us about the Christian moral life is that growing in virtue and holiness so as to become who God has created us to be is a struggle. But it's a struggle that we always undertake with God and in God's embrace, right? The Christian life flows out from and back towards the Eucharist. And the Eucharist nourishes us and gives us the grace to live the life of Christ day to day. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Right? To live the life of Christ is a real challenge for us sinners. And we see that signified in the wrestling match that Jacob undergoes here. This also brings us to another understanding of Jacob's wrestling partner. It seems clear that he's encountering the divine, either through an angel, through God himself, or through perhaps Esau. But in that struggle with this other, Jacob is in some sense wrestling with his own self or his own past, right? The darkness, the fact that this happens at nighttime suggests, obscurity. What must have been going through Jacob's head at that time? And we read that in light of the blessing as well. He asked for a blessing at the end. And it seems clear that having gone through this wrestling match, Jacob says, I want you to bless me now because I've struggled here with you. And I stole a blessing before. I deceived to be blessed. And now I've sort of earned it. I've worked for it, right? And this doesn't suggest that we can ever merit God's grace, right, or holiness. But if we understand the passage in the spiritual sense, right? The very wrestling match is sort of God's grace enveloping Jacob, right? To face his previous failings and to grow in holiness, right? To move on from that. Okay. So, right, growth in holiness is a struggle. And I think that's what the moral sense has to teach us here. So then finally, the anagogical sense. So how do we read this passage in terms of what our final end is? And I think the result of the wrestling match and Jacob receiving this new name suggests that our true identity, right, will only be reached in, or will only be perfected in the eternal embrace of God in heaven. So again, I think this is suggested by the name change of Jacob to Israel. We often see name changes in scripture, and each of those name changes happens after an encounter with God. So after Abram and Sarai enter into a covenantal relationship with God, their names are changed. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah. And then perhaps more famously, the persecutor of the Christians, Saul, after meeting God on his way to persecute Christians and being blinded, has his name changed to Paul. Right? Those name changes follow, as I say, or are the result of an encounter with God, but it also goes hand in hand with a new mission. Right? So Abram and Sarai become the first to enter into a covenantal relationship with God, and that's their new mission. Their identity is caught up with that new mission. Same thing for Paul's change from Saul to Paul, right? He's no longer going to be a persecutor of Christians. He is going to be one who proclaims the good news to as many people as he possibly can. And Jacob, have his name changed to Israel. Israel becomes the name of the nation, right? Who Jacob is a patriarch of. We think about the 12 tribes of Israel. So a name change always goes with a sort of discovery of who God is calling an individual to be, and follows on a very intense encounter with God. So another thing that we saw in our How Do We Read the Bible tutorial was suggested by Augustine, and that's that we can use other passages of Scripture that maybe are more straightforward to help make sense of passages that are less obscure, or we're not sure of what all the meaning a more obscure passage has for us. And there's a couple that I think are helpful here and follows on our reading of the spiritual senses in light of the literal sense. The first is Revelation 2:17. So this has in mind more the anagogical sense, but we'll see that it incorporates the allegorical sense as well, and the moral sense, right? So Revelations 2:17, to everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give a white stone. And on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. So look at the language there. Everyone who conquers, thinking in terms of a struggle, right? And in the book of Revelation, this is everyone who holds out to the end, right? Everyone who is willing to undergo persecution and struggle for the sake of Christ and living the life of Christ, right? God is going to give, he says, some hidden manna, and now reveal that person's unique identity most perfectly. The mention of manna has Eucharistic implications, and we saw in the allegorical sense that maybe we read this encounter of human and divine in Eucharistic terms, and the passage from Revelation here would help that reading along, right? So we also talked about receiving hidden manna, receiving Eucharist, right? Helps or is an encounter with God, right? That always transforms us, right? In light of this passage, that encounter helps us to realize who God's been created to be one step at a time. And then ultimately, in that eternal encounter in heaven, our identity will become perfectly clear to us. We will finally understand who God has created each and every single one of us to be. as a unique and unrepeatable reflection or image of his very life. And this is suggested also by St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 12. For now we see dimly as in a mirror, or in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. God always knows who we are, right? From before the time that we are born, right? Famous passage from Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. God always knows who we are. We are a completely unique and unrepeatable instance of the Imago Dei, a completely unique reflection of God's life. And God always knows what that reflection is meant to teach the world. It's us who take a long time and we struggle, as this passage suggests to us, to come to know who God's created us to be, right? And so we see dimly now. We can think back on the passage here, right? This happens at night. Jacob's kind of wrestling with somebody else. He's kind of wrestling with himself. He has these regrets in his mind. So he's maybe having trouble figuring out who he is really and what's in store for him in the future. And I think we all experience that. But our reading of the passage here, literal and spiritual senses together, suggests to us that we got to keep working. We got to keep working with God. We got to keep relying on God's grace. And we'll learn a little bit about ourselves along the way. Just like Abram, right? His identity is more fully known after he enters into that covenantal relationship with God. He becomes Abraham, and Sarah, same thing. Sarai to Sarah, and then Saul to Paul, Jacob to Israel. Each, right, encounter with God gives rise to a new mission, but a deeper understanding of who one is. And ultimately that understanding will be perfected in eternity, as we see in these two passages from the book of Revelation and 1 Corinthians. Okay, everybody. That's all I have for this time around. Again, if you have not checked out the Bible Basics Tutorials 1 and 2, be sure to go ahead and do that. Also, be sure to check the bottom of this page. We'll have some handouts that you can just run off and hand out to your students as part of this exercise. And I'll also include some further resources in case you wanted to consult some other works that would help you do the same sort of exercise with other passages of Scripture. All right. Thanks, everybody.